when they hear my name, they assume that I'm a hippie or that my parents were hippies, which is also, it's a fair consideration. It's a fair reach. But I was born Brando Kelly Ulloa, Ulloa. That is my birth name. I'm Mexican-American by birth. My mom was Mexican-American. We lived in Los Angeles in the 1970s, early 1970s. And there was a lot of political activism that was occurring in the late 60s and early 1970s. I mean, whatever sort of political interest you had, it was all colors of the rainbow, brown berets, black power, you name it. And for whatever reason, my mother grew fascinated with American Indian culture, the American Indian movement, and decided to rename me Brando Skyhorse. She also renamed herself Running Deer Skyhorse. She was born Maria Banaga, Banaga being a Filipino-American name. She's Mexican-American, but her stepfather was Filipino. And I didn't know that this wasn't my name or that this wasn't my backstory because she had given me a backstory and, photographs and the whole thing. I wasn't aware of what the truth was until I was about 12 or 13. And because my mother was a complicated person, a person who had severe mental health issues, she was suffering from borderline personality disorder, she encouraged me to keep up the lie. And because my mother could be sometimes incredibly violent, I kept up the lie. And I did so until my mother passed away when I was about 22, 23. And then I, slowly, surely became more comfortable telling people, a version of this story.
Okay, so that's the short. I mean, that's the short version. But
that's the very short version.
Yeah,
but again, it's all in a book I wrote. So
yeah, and you were raised in Echo Park, not far from here, where I am in Los Angeles.
That's right, born and raised in Echo Park, and the neighborhood in the 1970s and 80s. Yeah, we could do a whole podcast on that.
Well,
a lot of changes.
I was going to say, and now Echo Park is like Hipsterville, but back when you were being raised there, it was a different vibe, right?
It was the neighborhood that people drove through and locked their car doors on the way to Dodger Stadium. I can't think of a better way to describe it. There were police helicopters every night. It was the 80s. It was sort of like, gang violence. To me, it was home, right? So when you grow up, you don't think of these things. It's like, oh, this was a really unsafe neighborhood. But yeah, looking back in hindsight, it was, it was jagged. Let's call it that way. It's a jagged place to grow up.
And did you ever see or witness any crime or experience it, or were you the victim of any crime growing up?
No, I wasn't. Well, I wasn't the victim. Yeah, did I see crime from time to time? Yes, I did. Yeah, I saw purse snatchings. I saw, stuff that happened at the grocery store. My grandmother, was almost mugged on a bus. I saw people steal stuff out of our bags when we went to the grocery store. Things of that nature. Nothing I guess, I don't know, that would rise to the level of a serious incident. But yeah, I mean, there was that kind of petty crime that was just everywhere all the time. And it did seem whenever there was some sort of some sort of murder or some sort of gang related incident, the helicopters would just flood the area at night. And, it just would be all hours. There was that movie from, 91, Boys in the Hood?
Sure,
where, with Cuba Gooding, and, the helicopters are just this omnipresent sound. That's how it was growing up, just an endless barrage of, police noise. And especially also because the police academy is, I think, a mile up in Elysian Park. So, yeah, it was on the regular. But, I don't want to oversell it. It's not oh, I grew up in the hood and had, a hard life. It just, it was just kind of how it was.
Yeah, but you did have a hard childhood. I mean, by any standard measure, it was not the easiest childhood.
It was, that old cliche, it's coming from inside the house. A lot of my childhood was rough because my mom was a challenging person. I was raised essentially by my mother and my grandmother. And my mother had mental health issues. I had 5 stepfathers, 4 of whom had, records of incarceration. So in many ways, I feel it was safer in a way out on the streets than it was inside my house. So,
but you seem sunny, personality wise, sunny.
Oh, that's years of therapy.
Okay.
That's that's years and years of talk therapy and, acknowledging that when you're raised in that way, that, things are just not going to work for you in the way that they work for other people. So yeah, when I have a conversation and we can talk like this and have fun and have a good time and talk about my writing, etc., then it's all good. But, there are other things that I'm extremely anxious about, things that upset me greatly, things that, require me to be in therapy probably for the rest of my life. I'm getting on a plane tomorrow. I'm really nervous about flying. I don't know why. Again, a plane's never done anything to me. I've never had issues in a plane, unlike, my childhood or growing up with my mom or my grandma. So, yeah, it's weird how these things kind of, manifest themselves. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting hearing you talk about it and just thinking about it as somebody who, did not grow up that way, to think of it at the level of narrative.
Sure.
Like you were given a false narrative that you carried throughout your childhood. I mean, it wasn't just like mom was struggling with mental health issues, though she was, and was difficult and challenging and violent at times. Like all of that stuff aside, what's interesting and maybe most germane to this show is this idea of being given a story of yourself that is inaccurate, but yet internalizing it and believing it to be true. Like you said, she gave you a backstory. So did you have like a tribal affiliation growing up?
So my mother would give me stories up to a point, right? So she would tell me what my tribe was, which was apparently White Mountain Apache, and she would tell me roughly what part of the country we were from. But when it came time to give me actual credentials, no, there was no tribal affiliation. I was never registered with the BIA. I never had any of those kinds of specifics, in part because my mom knew, obviously, that she wouldn't have been able to produce that documentation. Having said that, when it came time to telling enough of the story to get people, I guess, on board or to convince them, she was a very compelling storyteller. And I think you're very astute in picking out why one of the things I'm obsessed with as a writer is the idea of narratives and false narratives and passing. I put together an anthology on ethnic and racial passing, which explores this. But
what do you mean by what do you mean by passing?
Oh, so passing is the idea when essentially somebody tries to occupy a space that's meant for somebody else, right? So I'm Mexican American. My mother astutely figured out, if I pass my son and myself as American Indian, we will no longer be just a couple of ordinary Mexicans from Echo Park. We will cease to be, again, growing up in Los Angeles, something magical, something spectacular. Oh my God, we're American Indians. And, there was this whole sort of ritual that my mom would, again, perform mostly for well-intentioned white people. We would go into jewelry stores and wherever there was a turquoise or a squash blossom jewelry, she would have somebody take the jewelry out and she would feel the jewelry and say oh, I can tell this was made by an American Indian. I could tell what reservation this was made on. None of that was real. None of that actually. Oh yeah, my mom was that like I said, I wrote a whole book about it. I don't want to talk your ear off about it. But
no,
there's
please.
there's just this sense that my mother was fascinated by the idea of reinvention. And I don't know if that's because growing up in Los Angeles, she was fascinated with Hollywood, she was fascinated with fame. I shudder to think about what my mom would be like now if she were alive, because she died before the age of the influencer, the Facebook and catfishing and all that kind of stuff. Because if she was alive, I have no doubt she would be manipulating the hell out of a lot of people.
Wow. It feels very, I got to say, it feels like something that is very Los Angeles. This whole thing, what do you want to call it? A grift or a hustle?
Yeah, a hustle. What? I think that's right. And again, I feel that's the part of the reason that I'm always fascinated by LA stories. My grandmother was born and raised in Los Angeles. One of the first stories she told me was about how her mother, who was obsessed with being a Hollywood starlet, I guess, took her to the premiere of City Lights, the Charlie Chaplin movie in 1929, downtown. Back when the movie premieres were downtown Los Angeles. And, I guess my grandmother was almost crushed to death or something. And instead of taking my grandma aside and saying, oh, are you okay? She's oh, you ruined my big moment. I was gonna meet a movie star. Like, you ruined my big moment. Like, there's this running sort of motif amongst my family members, people I know, this sort of like intersections with Hollywood, intersections with fame, getting close to, but not quite touching the sort of like,
the machine,
the Hollywood experience, the machine. Exactly.
Yeah. Well,
exactly.
But yeah, I mean, I think there's something also kind of charming and in a way like heartbreaking about this quest or this impulse toward reinvention of self. Like
Sure.
I mean, you have complicated feelings, I think, about maybe wherever you live. Like wherever you live will induce complicated feelings. But in Los Angeles, I feel like part of its charm is the fact that it can absorb people who have these big dreams, and it can help, some people realize these big dreams here. I mean, that is part of the allure, right? But it also can be really sad because a lot of people's dreams are not realized.
Yeah, there's always that flip, isn't it? And I feel that, for all of the books that I've worked on, the Madonnas of Echo Park in 2010, the memoir, this anthology, I'm passing this new book, My Name is Iris, there's a thread, there's a through line of these characters who are constantly seeking a place that they can call home, constantly seeking an identity that they can say is their own. And I'm fascinated by those kinds of narratives. And I do think that in Los Angeles in particular, there is this sense of accommodation, that it really doesn't matter where you're from, and it really doesn't matter what the particulars of your story are. If you're interesting and you can tell a good story, we'll make a space for you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the beauty of it, is that it can absorb kind of weirdos here, this town. Versus, I mean, we were talking before we came on the air, you now live in Indiana, you teach at IU in Bloomington. Mm-hmm. Not as easy to be a kind of eccentric in a place like that. I mean, it can be done, but it's not quite as, there's not as many.
Right, it's different. Like the geography is different, right? The breakdown of like people who are here from Indiana, people who have moved here, it's different. Bloomington has a more, obviously transient sort of feel to it because it is a college town. So people come in, they stay for a few years and they leave. But just even the racial and ethnic dynamics of a place like Bloomington, which are, again, more diverse than some of the other parts of Indiana that I've been to. It's different than when you go into Los Angeles. Like in Los Angeles, and again, I'm not just saying LA is like this, but for me, LA is always going to be like home, right? But when you go to LA, you go to the bank. The teller is Mexican American. The bank manager is Mexican American or African American or whatever it is. In places like Bloomington or other parts of Indiana, it's different. You can see that sort of almost that kind of caste system here, where it's a person of color is almost like doing a certain kind of job. And if you see them doing a different kind of job, it's different. So for me, I feel like being raised in Los Angeles, being shaped by that sense of, I want to say possibility for everybody, right? It made a difference. I know it's weird. I just said to you, I feel like LA is like home to me because I have relatives out there, relatives that I didn't know existed until about 13 years ago. Again, a whole other story.
Well, no, that's your father. You didn't discover until you were in your 30s, right?
My biological father took off when I was 3, or getting I know that my sisters might be listening to this. So took off, was chased away, whatever language you wanted to use. One day he was there and another day he wasn't. So when I was trying to start my second book, I, thought I had his name. Let's see if I can find him. And, people told me, oh, you're going to have to hire a private detective and the whole thing. And, I typed his name into whitepages.com and there he was. Took me about 3 minutes. I wrote him a letter and he wrote me back. And then I met him just as Madonnas was about to publish. And he had started over his new life with a new wife. And, he had 3 daughters. And, I all of a sudden I had 3 sisters. And the fascinating thing about this whole life is that, again, he hid me in plain sight. They showed me photo albums where I was in the photo album. And my sister was like, yeah, we just thought that was a cousin from Mexico or something. We didn't know that was his son. The sense of wow, incredible. Right?
Wait, he had done things with you? You had done things with him?
Oh, so he was, yeah. So he lived with me until I was 3. So they're like little photos. They're photos of me at, like, you know, my third birthday party, and like they had rented a pony and all this other stuff. And like he had obviously kept those photos and put them again interspersed between photos of his daughters and other family members. And so when they found out that, like, you know, oh, hey, like, you know, I'm your long lost brother, right? Like something out of like a Dickens novel or something.
Right.
You know, a couple of them were astonished. And yet my eldest sister was like, kind of had a feeling. I kind of knew. I had this sense, you know. She was at a birthday party for her cousins one day, and you know, one of them went up to her and said, you know, I know something about your dad you don't know. He has a son. Go ask him. Go. You think your dad's a good man? Go ask your dad about his son that he never sees, that he never talks about. And she was like about 9 or 10 years old at the time. And so all of a sudden, when she found out I existed, it was like that moment just came rushing back to her. That sense of like, oh my God, like, you know, what if I had like asked my father about this son? Like, would he have told me? Or would he have lied? You know? So again, layers of like identity, layers of like, you know, who are you? Who am I related to? Who am I connected to? They fascinate me as a writer. For, I guess, obvious reasons.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they didn't fascinate you, something would be severely wrong. But you have good relationships. Like you're like, you know, suddenly you have 3 sisters, but you don't meet them till you're what, in your 30s?
Yeah,
like
till my 30s, and they're all different ages. And you know, the beautiful thing about it is that I feel like there's kind of like the life I had before I met them and the life that I had after I met them. I met them in spring of 2010. And, you know, it was a very sort of complimentary thing in that I feel like after my mother and grandmother died when I was 23, 24 years old, I felt like basically I had no family. And then all of a sudden, here it was, an instant family. And, you know, as these things go, you never know how people are going to respond. But, you know, after about maybe one conversation, you know, because I think they wanted to know, like, who are you, why are you here, and do you want money? And since I didn't want money, and since I basically said I just wanted to know who you are, want to be in your life, you know, we just kind of like bonded. So we don't even use the term or the phrase half brother, half sister. They are my sisters, and I am their brother. And that's the life that we've lived for like the past 13 years or so.
Is there any I mean, like usually people, even if they don't meet until later, or there's a period of separation that lasts many years or something, there is something about blood, right? And like strange connections, like in kind of an immediate rapport or something. Was there any of that?
Yeah, there is, in the sense that, you know, my eldest sister, you know, like she is very keen on looking for connections between us. And she is the one that has read all of my books. You know, she's like, you know, the complete sort of like, I guess like historian, a librarian of like my writing experiences. You know, I've seen photos of, or I've met her nephews, her sons, excuse me, my nephews. To them, I'm Theo Brando, right? Like they're my nephews. I'm like Uncle Brando. And to look at one of her sons, her younger son, like it's like literally looking at photos of me when I was 8 or 9 years old. Like It's uncanny. Like the look, you know, the sort of the look around the eyes and the forehead, it's really incredible. And yeah, you know, I feel that as with anything with family, right? So much of it is showing up. So I show up, you know, I send Christmas presents, I send birthday gifts. I try to get out there as much as I can, sometimes not as often as I would like. Obviously, I think the relationship dynamics would be different if I lived in Los Angeles as well. But yeah, I don't know, it's just having family and having that kind of family has just been really, really special for me.
That's great. And you know, it's got to be, I mean, that moment or that time of your life when you're 23, 24, both your mother and your grandmother died close together, right? Like,
yeah. My mom was taking speed and fen to lose weight, which again, kind of an insane thing. She was 50. And it just was one of those very, very sudden things. You know, I got a phone call from her on a Saturday. I just moved to the East Coast. And then, you know, a few days later, my 5th stepfather called me and told me that, you know, she had died. And it was one of those moments where it was like, it was so sudden. I went out, you know, I just lost it for a while, you know, and it was a very, very dark period. And then, of course, several months later, my grandmother passed. And so these sort of 2 women, these towering figures that had essentially like had raised me, had taken care of me, all of a sudden they were gone.
Well, how did your mom die? She was taking speed and what? She had a heart attack?
She was taking, yeah, she died of something called, I guess, dilated cardiomyopathy, right? So basically, like, your heart gets so flabby it can't pump blood. And so because she was obviously not supposed to be taking speed, and I believe fen-phen, it came out later, like sort of lawsuits or whatever, but taking excessive amounts of fen-phen destroyed the elasticity in your heart, which basically prevents it from pumping blood. And so again, like, I don't know exactly how much she was taking, but, you know, when I came back home, like, there were just pill containers everywhere. So obviously, not under a doctor's orders, not doing it in a prescribed way. I think that sense of, you know, who she was, right? Like, she was so far away from that idea. Because, you know, my mother in the 70s, she was a beautiful woman. I know it's normal to say that. Yeah, your mother's a beautiful woman. She was a beautiful woman. She was very skinny. And then just over the years, she just gained lots and lots of weight. She became a recluse. You know, she was working at home for many years as a phone sex operator. It was the only work that I guess she felt comfortable doing. And,
did you as a child witness this? Like, was mom just like doing phone sex while you're like...
Yeah. Well. So let me say, like I said, it's in the memoir. I feel like I'm selling the wrong book here.
Listen, we're gonna get to it. Don't worry, we're gonna get to the new book.
So,
don't worry.
In the last book I wrote about, yeah, you know, like, my mom was conscientious about the fact that, like, oh, okay, so, like, you know, the door should be closed when I'm working, you know, and, like, when the door's open, you can come in. But, yeah, like, I would overhear it. And, you know, the story that my mom loved to tell, because, again, she was the best storyteller I've ever known in the world, she would tell me it was my idea. We were sitting on the couch. I was apparently 8 or 9 years old. We were watching Donahue, and, you know, Phil Donahue, right?
Oh,
like,
yeah,
the guy,
yeah.
the big talk shows. And so one of the segments was, like, on, like, you know, phone sex operators, people who, like, you know, have sex with men on the phone for money. And supposedly I leaned over to her and I said, you could do that. Is that true? I don't feel like that's something I would do as a 9-year-old, but maybe, I don't know, because she was unhappy at work. She was a headhunter before she started this line of work, you know, for I guess, like, management jobs, etc. She had been cheated out of a commission. All of that, again, seems plausible. And so she answered an ad, tiny little ad, back in the newspapers, or like one of those, like, I guess the LA Weekly, alternative weekly. The name of the company was called Inside Moves. And, you know, she started working. Yeah, see, this is so elaborate, right? Like, all these little details that I've managed to cling to, right?
I love it.
She started working there. And, yeah, she did that for, gosh, I don't know, 15, 16 years? Yeah, 15, 16 years for most of her life. And the problem with that, again, you know, she was working at home. She was making money that wasn't taxed. So, like, at a certain point, like, you know, she wasn't paying rent to my grandmother. So much money was coming in. But, you know, she stopped leaving the house. She stopped just taking care of herself. And I think she just drifted further and further away from, I guess, this idea of, like, you know, oh, like, I'm a beautiful woman. Like, I live in Los Angeles, you know, like, I have dreams and aspirations. Like, I don't think that was her aspiration. I don't think, to be a phone sex operator. But yet somehow here we are, right? Like, she just fell into sex work. And the idea of, like, making men's dreams come true, albeit very temporarily, right? That's what she ended up doing. And I think it destroyed her emotionally and physically.
I was going to say, like, there's got to, I mean, if you do that for 15 or 16 years, day after day, having these conversations, pretending to be aroused or whatever, I mean, that's got to be, like, there's got to be a degenerative effect on your...
And again, not even, like, you know, the way that it's done now, right? Like, because, again, we're talking the early 1980s. So, like, the idea of a headset, right? Just the idea of a headset that you could pair to a phone. I remember spending months with her looking for some kind of, like, headset operation that she could, like, pair up with her phone so she wouldn't basically be, like, you know, again, like, holding the phone, like, clutched to between her shoulder and her ear. Like, just that, like, that physical degenerative process. Like, I feel like the job just kind of, like, ate away at her, just pieces at a time, physically and emotionally. So yeah, it was a rough hustle for sure.
Did she have any aspiration to be a celebrity? Like, did she want to be an actor?
Not explicitly, but I think that she was kind of right on that line. I think that for her, just the joy of telling people stories and having an audience, like one-to-one, she loved it. She loved it. I don't know if she had that sense of like, oh, I want to go and do this in a more professional way, like, taking headshots or anything like that. I think she just really enjoyed the immediacy, the one-on-one nature of like, I'm going to tell you a story. And again, depending on what kind of mood she was in, you would hear stories about how she crossed paths with Ted Bundy, Dennis Wilson. Like I could go on.
Wait,
like just
when did she she crossed paths with Ted Bundy?
That's what she said. Oh yeah, she went. Again, it's all in the memoir. The first story that I tell people about my mom is she was like out with some guy, and again, it was late '60s, early '70s, so maybe kind of plausible because maybe Bundy was in like Southern California for a while, and it was supposedly some guy that had like I guess she had met at like a bar or something, and like he was like, oh, like I can drive you home, or I forget what the exact circumstances was. So he drove her home, and instead of driving her home, he drove her off on this like kind of shadowy path somewhere out in the woods somewhere, maybe out somewhere in Griffith Park. And supposedly, just as he like left his car to go get something from his trunk, this motorcycle gang of Hell's Angels came in, swooped in. He takes off. She runs toward them. She then hops on the back of a Harley, and then they take her back home. And then months and months, or I guess a couple years later, she's on watching television, and she sees this guy on the television, and it's like, oh my God, that's the guy who like abducted me. And of course, it was Ted Bundy.
I'm prepared to believe that.
Yeah,
sounds right.
It sounds right. It all lines up. And of course, right? Yeah, of course it was Ted Bundy that abducted her. And of course it was a gang of Hell's Angels that saved her. And of course, you know what I mean? Like, it was always these sorts of like stacking upon stacking upon stacking of details. And, the thing that like I think about in talking about my mom now is that my mom's life was so fantastical. Right, just the whole bit with like Skyhorse and writing to men in prison and things of that nature. It's like she didn't need this additional layer of invention. She didn't need this sort of like all these sort of fantastical stories to make herself interesting to people. And that's the one sort of thing, again, years and years of therapy. Like if I could go back in time and just have like 5 minutes with my mom, that's what I would say. Like you never needed any of that. Like people are already drawn to you. People are already compelled by who you are and the stories you tell. Just that's enough.
So we talk about like Los Angeles and the entertainment industry and the kinds of people that are attracted to this place. And then obviously there's this narrative that was, placed upon you as a young child.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your first name, I can't help but notice that your first name is Brando, which,
yes.
which does have a Native American correlation because he was a huge advocate. Was that the connection? Is that the reason why?
Of course. And, again, if you spent any time with my mother, it wouldn't be 5 minutes in before she would tell you, oh, well, I met Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando is Brando Skyhorse's godfather because of course he was, right? Not the godfather who was in the movie, but literally my actual godfather. She told this story to one of her like long-term boyfriends who became kind of like a surrogate father figure to me. That was the first story that she told him, and he could believe it 100%. Why? Who would make up something that ridiculous? Well, my mom. Yeah.
Well, and we should say for people listening who might not have context, Marlon Brando, the famous American actor, was not himself Native American, but was an advocate for the Native American cause.
That's right.
And famously, when he won, I believe, the Oscar for The Godfather,
that's right.
Instead of going on stage and accepting the award himself, he sent in his place a Native American young woman who was probably like 22 years old or something.
Sacheen Little Feather. That's
right.
right.
And she accepted the award. And the reason he did that was because he was trying to bring attention to the awful way that the movie and television industries had portrayed Native Americans on film. And they were often, in old Cowboys and Indians movies and that sort of, narrative dynamic, they were often mischaracterized and just treated horribly. So I feel like The Move, I mean, it was kind of lampooned at the time, and I want to say this woman got booed by like John Wayne, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's a move that I think has aged well.
I think so. And, again, thinking about like timing and such, right? Because, I believe that happened in March or April 73, because I think The Godfather came out in 72 and I was born in August. So obviously, again, like this kind of like rhetoric, this kind of like attitude was in the air. And, it is something that, like, I am conscientious of, that, the reason I told you this story at the beginning, like, oh, I'm not American Indian, because that was one of the sort of push-pull dynamics that my mom would have, is that she would always say, you don't need to tell anybody that you're Mexican. You're Brando Skyhorse. That's it, right? And for me, like, that just never sat well. And the older I got, like, the less uncomfortable it made me. And, she would say all the time, like, oh, you're too honest. You're too honest. Like, you can't be my son. Like, you're too honest. Like, she would always be conscious of the story, right? She's like, that's not the story people want to hear. They don't want to hear that you're a Mexican American. To me, like, that's a much more interesting story. It's so much more interesting to be Brando Ulloa, who is now Brando Skyhorse, a Mexican American who had a mom that had some issues, as opposed to the story that she was trying to create for me, which was Brando Skyhorse, son of an American Indian chief, and somebody who was like, who had like connections with Marlon Brando. Because to me, the idea of, usurping someone's identity, right? Usurping someone's culture, right? And taking from a people, taking from a heritage and a culture that has had so much taken away from him, to me, like that was the line. And I'm curious about how my mother and I would have navigated that dynamic, because for me to acknowledge this story would have also meant she would have had to have acknowledged hers, that she wasn't actually running Dear Skyhorse, that she was actually Maria Banaga, somebody that was raised in Lompoc and then came back down to LA and, lived a kind of very ordinary like lifestyle. So yeah, it's interesting.
It's interesting is an understatement. I don't care how great your imagination is. There's absolutely no way that you could possibly ever conjure a story better than the story in which you were raised. I mean, like, it's like beyond belief. You know what I'm saying? Like this thing, like truth is stranger than fiction, I think is what I'm trying to say.
It is. And, when I was constructing the memoir, like I was very, very conscientious because, I would have these conversations with my editor and, there's the whole thing, back in the early 2000s about like, falsified memoirs and blah, 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 blah. And, I guess for me, it was like the reason that book took me so long was because the first draft of it was essentially written almost like a legal brief. Like there were no scenes. There was maybe like 3 lines of dialogue. And, my editor kind of, to her horror, looked at this and was like, what is this? Like, we can't sell this. This isn't a memoir. It's like this, you're trying to prove that all the things in this book happened. And, she was like very, very clear. She's like, look, if we care about you as the narrator, we'll believe it, and then you just have to trust that the reader will take you the rest of the way home. And it was really, really smart advice. So that whole process, just writing that memoir and getting it down for me was cathartic for so many reasons, but most of all for having a place where I could finally just start at the beginning of the book. Here's everything that happened to me. Here are all these wild, fantastical stories, beginning, middle, and end. And I could process it and understand it in a way that that was enlightening and hopefully entertaining, as opposed to the way that I approached my history up to this point, which was like so complicated and so convoluted and so many twists and turns. So, yeah.
I mean, for like a narrative, like a life narrative, as complicated as yours was growing up, the act of having to put it into book form, having to make it palatable to a general audience, a general readership, must have been useful to you in some way, because it sort of forced you to like look at it and make sense of it and put it in order. I don't know. That just seems like a nice thing to do, especially for something as complex as your childhood.
Well, you know what it was, Brad? The thing of it is once it became a book, once it became this physical object, all of a sudden, and I know this is a weird thing to say, it's like my mom made sense.
Right.
It's like I could see, oh, this wasn't like, this hysterical, crazy life that I had wasn't just like, oh, some sort of Jerry Springer soap opera.
Right.
It was just a series of really poor decisions compounded over time, like bank interest. And so for me, just to kind of see that sense of like that causal link, oh, okay, so yeah, like my family didn't start out as a sideshow. Here's step one, here's step two, here is sort of the causal links, between all of these actions. And now it makes sense. And now my mom makes sense. And now my grandma makes sense. So just for that alone, it was it was a really gratifying experience.
That is a much better way of saying what I was trying to say. And, I'm not going to make you go through all 5 of your stepfathers, but you mentioned it briefly. I won't do that to you. But
I could do the greatest hits if that's what you'd like.
Well, I mean, I'm sure my listeners would love it, but what they should do is read all your stuff, and especially the memoir. But, I want to kind of tie this point to the fact that you went on to go to Stanford. You got your MFA at Cal Irvine.
At UC Irvine, that's right. Yeah,
okay.
That's right. Yeah.
So
yeah.
An incredibly well-educated person, somebody who came out of a very difficult childhood by any measure, and yet goes to Stanford and then gets his MFA at one of the finest creative writing programs in the country. That's not, statistically speaking, the likeliest scenario for somebody who grew up the way that you did. And I know that your mother was a very difficult woman, and your grandmother was there, so they're raising you, but it's tough. And then all these men, many of whom had records of incarceration, as you said, were coming through the house. Mm-hmm. Were there any of them that had like a real positive impact on you? Like, how do you piece together the fact that you kind of made it out of this situation and moved on to live a productive and healthy life? You're getting therapy, you're teaching college, you're publishing books that are winning awards. I mean, you're a big success story. It's a triumph. Did any of these men play a role in helping you get a sense of yourself, or talk about that part of it?
Yeah. I mean, this is a question that I have been asked before. I don't really have a clean answer. I think it's twofold. Number one, obviously, in writing about my mom and my grandmother, the stories that are salacious are the ones that are the most interesting. She would do all these kind of fantastical things, both of them. But then there's also the really boring side of both of these women. The sides that ensured that, I'm going to take Brando to get his first library card. I'm going to take Brando to a bookstore and show him these phonics workbooks far beyond his age, and we're going to sit down and do them. Both my mother and grandmother did this. And they did this for, well, again, until my mom basically became a recluse, but my grandmother in particular, they would do this for years. There was one father figure I have, and again, if you read the book, you'll see who it is, who also, I think, realized that, this kid's something special. And so he would take me to activities that I guess he thought, were appropriate for an adult, but maybe not. For instance, I think I was 10 or 11 when he took me over to, in LA, there's the Taper 2, not the Mark Taper Forum, the Taper 2 that's on the side of the Hollywood freeway.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's still there or not, but it used to be a little theater, a little black box theater, which you would find in New York. And he took me to a Spalding Gray monologue. Who takes an 10 or 11-year-old kid to a Spalding Gray monologue? You know what I mean? But at some point, I guess he thought, oh, did you find that interesting? Yeah, sure, I guess. I mean, the guy talked a lot. I don't know, what we were supposed to do. So I think that, there's always, I'm always conscientious to acknowledge that even with people who have mental health issues, and even, in my mother and grandmother's darkest rages, and it got pretty dark, as they got older, there were, instances, of physical violence and assault, and it was tough. There was still that flip. And again, borderline, right? When somebody is borderline,
Yeah, what
On
is
one
that?
hand,
What is borderline personality? It seems like
so
mysterious to me.
yeah, so borderline personality disorder, from what I've gathered from the limited I've been able to read about it, is that you have somebody who essentially is not able to get a firm footing on like what reality is. So it's constantly shifting, in which they, on one hand, will perceive you as like their best friend in the world and they can't do enough for you. It's almost like a drug. It's like a drug where they'll be like, oh my God, Brando, like we're going to do all these things for you. I'm going to take you to Disneyland. I'm going to take you to this musical. You're so bright. You're so smart. You know, you're my son and the world is your oyster. And then 6 hours later, there's like a dip. And that dip is frightening. It often comes out of nowhere. You are a horrible human being, Brando. You are not my son. I don't even know what son you are. I wish I had aborted you. I heard I wish I had aborted you probably about maybe 3 or 4 times a week.
Jesus.
Right? And then 6 hours later, oh, Brando, you know I didn't mean that. You know that I love you. Here, let me make it up to you. Here, let me give you some money. Why don't you go to Disneyland with Grandma? Why don't we order pizza? Like there was this constant like push-pull. So you never really had a sense of, again, a firm footing of who's my parent? Who's in charge here? And as my mom got older and as my grandma got older, you know, especially with my mom in particular, the mental health issues, they were just compounded. And obviously, you know, that made it more challenging to have relationships with a number of the stepfathers that lived in my house. So I spent a lot of time watching 80s movies. 80s pop culture movies because we had cable. And I think somewhere along of those like cheesy, ridiculous, stupid 80s comedies and movies, I saw, oh, there's suburbia. Look at that house that they have in Ferris Bueller's Day Out. That looks like a cool house. I bet that's a cool neighborhood. Look at how normal their family is. And I think just over time, right, just that saturation of pop culture, all the books, because again, I was a very early reader, somehow, some way, it got thrown into this stew where I realized, oh, that's my way out. That's what I need to do to get out.
Tell stories.
It's not, tell stories, basically. Yeah.
But maybe like, I mean, it makes a certain kind of sense. Your mom told stories, but you told them in a different way, maybe a healthier way.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. But yeah, I think that sense that, you know, I often tell my students that, you know, storytelling can save your life. It doesn't mean that it'll save everyone's life, but I think it saved this one. I think it saved mine. Yeah,
no doubt, man. It's wild. It's wild, and it's, you know, it's just impossible to talk to you for the first time without talking about that stuff.
No worries, man. No worries.
Like, so I do want to let's get to the new book. Which is your second novel.
So it's it's my third book, but it's actually my fourth. But some people don't count anthologies.
But second novel.
So it's my second novel.
Right.
It's 13 years after the first one, and
which is called The Madonnas of Echo Park.
Madonnas of Echo Park. Yeah, and
which we should tell people won the PEN Hemingway Award.
It did win the PEN Hemingway Award. It won the Sue Kaufman Award for first fiction. And, I'm very proud of that book. I feel like, I don't know if you have authors here who kind of like look back on their first books and say like, oh, like I would do all this and I would change that and blah, 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 blah. I was like, you know what? Like, I love the fact that like it's a snapshot of what my abilities as a writer were then. Like, I love that it's preserved somewhere.
Sure. So, yeah. That's a healthy way to think of it. I mean, I've had like mixed feelings about my first book through the years. And I think I've gotten to that place where it's like, you know what? It is what it is. I was in my 20s. Like, go easy on yourself.
Well, yeah, you had to write it, right? Like, there was no other way around it. Like, you had to write it, and you had to write it that way.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah.
That was it. Take it or leave it. So, but the new book, My Name is Iris, is a book, like, as you said, it's a story about identity, very much. It's about a woman named Iris Prince, who's actually named Inez, but kind of renames herself because she has a teacher, like a rude teacher, basically growing up who doesn't know how to pronounce her name. And so she renames her and then she sort of adopts it because, Iris, if we're going to take the name that she kind of has glommed onto and given herself, essentially, is very concerned with assimilation and belonging, and just not wanting to be noticed. This is a person who kind of desperately wants to blend, right?
Yeah. And again, like just that whole story, right, about how my young character Inez gets renamed by a school teacher and becomes Iris, right? I'm sure some of your more astute listeners have noticed some parallels between my backstory and why I'm drawn to this kind of narrative. But I think that if you ask people, like, that's a very common story. It's not only a common LA story, but it's a common immigrant story. It's a common American story. And, I wanted to kind of start from a place of a character who feels that she has essentially, quote unquote, made it. And so we start with a character who feels very comfortable talking to you. It's a very intimate first person voice. So if you pick up the book, you'll see this is a character that's very comfortable talking to you. She knows where the lines are. She knows what she'll tell you. She knows what she won't discuss. But it's this sense of immediacy, almost like kind of like instant friendship, and the sense of like, I'm going to tell you this story because it's an American story. And you're an American, and obviously, you would relate to this, and you would relate to my experience. And you start off with somebody who is ready to make a transition. She got married. The marriage wasn't particularly bad. It just wasn't right for her. She separates. It's an amicable separation. Everything kind of moving by the book. She moves into a new house. She has her 9-year-old daughter. And she has set herself in the quote-unquote perfect suburban neighborhood. And she realizes, just before things go south in this book, she realizes, oh, look, I've accomplished everything that I've wanted. And I've done so through hard work and dedication and keeping my head down and my mouth shut and not making any waves. That's the American way. And she wakes up one morning and she's got a beautiful view outside. She's got her front lawn and everything. And all of a sudden, there is a wall in her front yard where there was no wall before.
Okay, so I gotta stop you. One of the things that I want to say that's top of mind for me about this book, and I should say this is kind of top of mind for me about a lot of books that I'm reading lately, just as a function of time, is that there's something very Trumpy about this book. So like a lot of novels being published now have like a Trumpy vibe because they were written during that era. Also a pandemic vibe.
Yeah.
Like it's just natural because of the calendar, that people were quarantining or were, moving through those strange years and volatile years. It's natural that there would be a lot of books that are inflected with that. And this one certainly is.
Yeah. And I think it's again, so important for me that the T word, the T word is never mentioned in this book.
Right.
There's no relation. There's no like, sort of like bellicose ramblings. There's no sort of like, pulling in from like, modern day experience, because I realized in an early version of this book that any attempt at satire would be outstripped. I literally could not keep up with how ridiculous things have been in this country over the past 6 years. Anything that I would have written would have been like completely like moved on down the line. So for me, the challenge was like, how can I write something that is representative of my experience? Because for me, the past few years as a Mexican American, Trump is relevant. It's about the wall, right? And for me, for the past 6 to 7 years, like hearing that word over and over and over again, it became something different. The idea of like what a wall is. You even say that word now, wall. Like it used to be a dead noun. Now it's like the punch of an advertising slogan, like something you would say at a sports game. And like, thinking about, again, when I started this book in 2016, the word became animated. It became something alive. So it's like, is there a way that I could bring this into a book without all of the connotations, without all of the sort of the Make America Great Again? Because, none of that's really necessary. The core of this book is what is this one woman willing to do in a country and a landscape that she thought was hers and is slowly, systematically being stripped away. How far is she going to go?
Well, okay, so we should tell people, just to kind of give them the gist of this novel, that the world of the novel is, like, I don't know if the place is defined. It's just somewhere in like the American Southwest, it seems like.
Yeah, it's not really defined. It could be really anywhere.
Yeah. It felt Southwesty to me. Or maybe just because I'm in California, I was imagining it.
Sure.
But
Sure.
the situation at hand is dystopian. We have a new technology called the band. So there's like this kind of sci-fi dystopian, techno-futuristic aspect to the book. There is, as you said, this wall that just starts growing in her front lawn. So that's like supernatural or magical realism. There's that aspect. Then there's also like a ghost story aspect.
Yep.
Where there's this friend of hers named Brenda that she was, childhood buddies with, who was killed in a mass shooting at a McDonald's.
Yep.
So there's these different things. And then she's got the family thing, just kind of the more ordinary, like real life sort of stuff, where she's a mother, has a 9-year-old daughter, divorced from this husband, her parents, her sister. There's just family stuff. So it's a family novel too. And the world that everybody's living in, and the real tension of the novel, has to do with the fact that Iris's parents are not American citizens.
That's right.
And so everybody
right.
who is an American citizen in this dystopian, not too distant future, all too plausible, version of America, everybody who is a citizen has to wear this band, which is, some sort of newfangled technology that people can scan. You can pay for things with it, right? It's an instant way for people to identify physically as a citizen, just because you can see the band on people, but it's also a way for law enforcement and even businesses to verify that you're a citizen before
you can.
All that kind of stuff. So the big narrative tension of the story has to do with the fact that you can't get in this novel, in the story, in the world of this novel, you can't get a band unless you are the child of American citizens.
That's right.
And so that's the conundrum for Iris, is that her parents are not citizens. Her daughter can get a band, right?
Yep.
But she can't, and think the walls are sort of closing in. Things are getting dark quickly. The rules are taking effect as we move through this novel. And so there's this kind of vice grip feeling of like, oh shit, this is the way things go. This is what the last few years have taught us, is that it's not usually like a sudden, all at once sort of moment where things get terrible. It's a slow creep, right? And you feel that. You draw that very well in this book.
Thank you, Brad. You were describing all these different genres, and I was like, there's really something for everybody, really. I mean, if you want a family novel, we've got that. If you want a thriller, supernatural, read a few pages. If it's not the genre you like, skip a few. You might get to a genre you do like. I don't know. But, the idea behind this, I think, is, who am I? Where am I? Right? I feel like a lot of the rhetoric, that I've heard over the past few years, right? From well-intentioned people is like, this is America? ? And, again, as a person of color, it's like, well, of course this is.
Right.
Of course this is. And, that's not meant in like a, derogatory or, uncomplimentary way. It's just an observation. It's just really an observation. And the thing that I feel made this book so challenging to write, but also at the same time so essential to write, was to try to get to the core of Iris's true feelings. What do you do when you have so much of your identity invested in this specific kind of Americanness? This Americanness which has been, I feel like, drilled into many of us of a certain age, that if you do all the right things and you jump through the right hoops and you say all the right things and you follow all of the rules, Iris is nothing else but a rule follower. If you do all of that, well, then you're home, right?
And things are going to go well for you.
Yeah, you can have the American dream.
Which is another, just to kind of keep this thread running through the conversation, it is very much another kind of narrative that I guess we're all fed if we grow up here to some extent, maybe some of us more so than others. But Iris, as a human being, is very invested in that story. and it's its own kind of fiction.
It's a powerful story. It's a story that has motivated the American ethos, I would say, for hundreds of years. It's an incredibly compelling narrative. The bootstrap narrative, the sense that, if you have not found your place, if you have not found your security, your sense of identity, that's not America's fault. That's your fault. You did something wrong. You somehow violated the rules.
Right. So I'm always fascinated when I talk to writers who are able to do the sorts of things that you do in this book, where you have what is, in essence, like a suburban family story unfolding. And then suddenly, just like without really any explanation, a wall starts growing in this woman's front lawn that some people can see and some people can't see. Mm-hmm. There are certain rules, that I guess you had to come up with for this thing. And then there's a ghost, Brenda. It's sort of creepy. It's spooky. Brenda shows up, but it's like, to make those things work on the page and to include them all of a sudden in a story that is not fantastical otherwise. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that blend is fascinating. Walking that line and making it work. Can you talk a little bit about like the things that you have to do as a writer to make sure that you don't lose a reader by doing those things? Like, how do you blend those disparate elements in a way that is like workable and that a reader will buy into?
Well, first, let me thank you for acknowledging that it did work, because I don't think I was convinced myself that I was able to pull this off up until maybe when the book was actually published and sent out and started getting reviews. I think I still was like, huh? Like, put all of this in one book? Like, couldn't have spread it around 3, 4, 5 different novels? There's always that sense of insecurity, that sense of like, have I taken another left turn? Have I, gone too far out? Have I made this something ridiculous? Right? Because if I were to describe, like, if you're just to describe these components, oh, you read Brando Skyhorse? Wow, great name. What's the book about? Oh, it's a mystery and it's a thriller and a ghost story. Like, oh, well, like, all in one book? Like, right? That sense of like, what's the one sort of like Jenga block that you put on top that collapses the whole thing? And the thing that I feel, this is something that, like, I spent a lot of time thinking about, a lot of time thinking about with, students here at IU, both in the undergraduate and the graduate level program, is what does your character want? What does your main character really want? And as long as that goal is credible, and it could be a fantastical goal, it could be like you want the Holy Grail or whatever, as long as that goal, that desire is credible, I believe a reader will follow you everywhere. Anywhere you want to go in the book. And to me, again, you read those first few pages of the book, it's clear what Iris wants. She just wants to blend in nice and easy. She just wants to be one of us, one of the gang. And she just wants to know, what are the rules? Just tell me what the rules are. Whatever it is you want me to do to be quote-unquote American, I'll do it. And she believed she had done it. And then all of a sudden she realizes, all these external forces. And again, this is a journey that she has to go through the whole novel. Like, she's piecing it together as we're piecing it together. She comes to that realization that, maybe my understanding, my desire was perhaps a little misguided. Maybe I need something else to desire. Maybe I need something bigger to want. Maybe that's going to finally move me from like one end of this narrative to the other. So as far as balancing all these different genres, like, I really trusted in Iris, and I really trusted in her belief that what she wanted was credible and believable.
I think like there are certainly people like that, right? Who, I kind of have a little bit of that. I always say, like, wherever I live, I end up dressing like the median dude in my vertical. Like, I lived in Colorado and I suddenly had like long hair and was wearing like puffer vests and, I don't know
but you also lived in Indiana too.
And right? I had like a hat on backwards and I chewed tobacco. I just want to blend in. Like, I don't want
Yeah,
anybody,
sure.
especially visually. Like, I don't want to stand out.
Yeah,
I
right.
can't like these people who like have like this really like kind of flamboyant style. They walk out of the house and they're wearing this, everyone's just like looking at them. I cannot think of anything worse than that, to walk out into public and have all eyes on me. I just want to like blend in. I like that. I like that sort of anonymity. But I think there's obviously a different, like there's a different dynamic at work for Iris, where like, yeah, she wants to blend, but she wants to blend for reasons of assimilation. Like, she doesn't want to stir the pot, doesn't want anybody calling her out. She just wants to like, feel a sense of deep belonging.
A deep belonging, and right there, right? That's how all the pieces, at least as I see it, that's how they all fit together. From her parents, she learns you blend in, you become a success. You get to like buy a house and live a nice, quiet life. The ghost story from Brenda, right? As you mentioned, one of her, young friends who was murdered in a McDonald's. And again, if you are familiar with California history, that's me dipping in again, because there was a massacre in a McDonald's in 1984. And
Oh, wow. I
that
didn't know
massacre,
that.
yeah, that happened in San Ysidro. And the person whose name I'm not going to speak, who committed this atrocity, something like 21 people were murdered.
Oy.
And he chose a McDonald's specifically that was popular with Mexican Americans, Hispanic Americans. He deliberately chose that. Then, of course, also, the Walmart massacre in El Paso, right? So Iris, my character, is learning these lessons that if you are too visible, you could be hurt, you could be shot, you could be killed, you could be like whatever, right? So if I draw this from my parents, keep my head down, do XYZ, I'll be a model citizen. If I do this over here, I don't make waves. Like, I mind my manners, like I follow all the rules. Nothing can hurt me. And it's a pretty, again, it seems like a sensible way to live until this tide basically knocks at her door and says, you know what? The days for you looking out for yourself and looking out for your daughter are over. What are you going to do now?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's unsettling. And it's all too plausible and real, especially for people of color, for people who are undocumented. I mean, there's so many people living on a kind of knife's edge in this country.
Yes,
and
that's right.
this book speaks
That's
to
right.
that. And it speaks to that. And what's interesting is that there's so many people who are like kind of living on that knife's edge and sort of come here on that knife's edge. And that's their only real experience of this place. But in Iris, you have somebody who thought of herself as kind of fully assimilated.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
suddenly she finds herself on that knife's edge. That's a more dramatic set of circumstances, right? I mean, it's like, I think it's a big, it's massively destabilizing. Let's just put it
It's
that way.
right. It's the sense of like, oh, what happens after the happily ever after? So for me, she starts at the happily ever after, and then piece by piece has this unraveled. And, again, talking about these characters as if they're real, I feel like Iris is a really good sport going through all of these really horrific types of episodes throughout the book. But what I wanted to get to, what I was really interested in investigating, because it's a question that I ask about myself as a person, that I think anyone living in America is asking themselves, like, where are we? What's going on here? And if I am somehow dissatisfied or nervous, afraid about the direction that our country is headed in, what am I prepared to do about it? What can I do about it?
Yeah. I think, question a lot of us are asking ourselves. Like,
Yeah.
it's a really unsettling time in this country's history. And it's just an unsettling time to be a human being, period. I feel like with the climate and with the like geopolitical situation, like everything, I mean, I guess it's always been thus, right? Things have always been apocalyptic and weird and bad for humanity on this planet, but it just feels like maybe extra dramatic right now.
It does feel like it requires a lot of labor just to be, present,
Yeah.
just to be here. And yeah, like I was I was gonna say to you, but trust me, this is a really good book. You'll really want to read this, because I'm thinking like, wow, this sounds really heavy.
Well,
So I hope to anyone that's listening here, I'm not leaving you with the impression of like, yeah, this is a really big downer, and like it just kind of ends. I hope that any art, right, any work that you said you've written a book and you've written books, the whole, I think, objective of an artist, right, is you are creating from a place of hope. You have to, right? Like you are creating from the sense of, here's what I see around me, here's what I find problematic, here's my contribution to the conversation. Will this impact people? Will people read this? Like, is this something that, people might like, find some sort of, not to say that art needs to be useful, but to get some sort of like message, some kind of understanding. I have to believe that like, that is one of the best things that art can do for us and can teach us.
well, what about the process of writing a female protagonist?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a creative risk, to write outside of your gender and to have to take on the responsibilities associated with that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think it was important for me to write from a woman's perspective, in that once it became clear what Iris's concerns were, safety, security, etc., I realized that so many of these concerns overlapped with those that were shared by my mother and grandmother. I was raised in a house of very unstable people, I guess, for lack of a better, more polite phrase. But the 1-2 constants were my mother and my grandmother. And again, even in their darkest days where, they were emotionally and physically abusive, they were still my caretakers. And so I think that, having been raised in a house filled with women caretakers and being privy to what that entails, what that involves, how are we going to get, who's going to go get the groceries? What are we making for dinner? Like, who's going to handle like the laundry? Like all these sorts of like, just kind of like things about just your day-to-day existence, but also, my survival. How are we going to get Brando, shoes? Like, you don't get your check until Friday. When are we going to get Brando's clothes? All this sort of stuff that was never really, I don't think it ever crossed any of like my stepfather's paths. Like the idea, I don't think, with the exception of maybe one stepdad, none of them really cooked or made a meal. None of them did any chores. None of them really contributed any money to the household. So there was just this sense of like these kinds of like, almost like ghosts in a way. They would kind of like drift in and out of like my, like, I guess like my life, like my upbringing. So to me, when it came time to like, okay, I want to write about this character. She's a caretaker. She has very sort of specific ideas about what safety and security mean. It felt natural to draw on my experience growing up with two very strong women caretakers.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. The fact that you would be able to write a dimensional and believable female protagonist, considering you were raised by these two women.
Yeah, I hope it's credible. Yeah, because again, as a writer, you always do the best you can. I hope that it's credible. But again, like it feels like, Iris's concerns, many of her concerns were my mother's concerns or my grandmother's concerns. And, that's something that just felt very natural to me to kind of like to gravitate towards. And I also just thought it would just make, just make for a more interesting and a more compelling story. The idea that, here is a woman who essentially is, as you said, like literally the walls are closing in on her, metaphorically and literally. How's she going to like piece this together? Who's going to believe her? Herself a woman of color. Who's going to consider her fears, her anxieties credible? What is she going to do, for help, for guidance? That I think was something I was also interested in as well.
All right. Well, before I let you go, I want to talk to you about a big piece of your writerly education. We already mentioned that you went to Stanford and then went on to get your MFA at Irvine. But you also moved east to New York and worked, I believe, at Grove as a nonfiction editor for a decade.
I was there a few years. I was there a few years, and the experiences I had working at Grove with the authors, there were, it was another form of education. If that makes any sense, it was another way of learning how to construct a narrative. There's nothing quite as compelling as like having to communicate to another writer who is incredibly capable, who knows what they're doing, who is maybe lost or maybe kind of like, can't really kind of figure their way out, to be able to articulate to them, hey, I see the narrative, I see the arc, let's try it this way. Let's do it this way. It was incredibly educational.
I bet, because it forces your hand. It forces you to look at the thing from a different angle, a different perspective. And it makes me think that like the entire publishing industry would be well served if there was a more holistic education somehow for all of us. Like if, for example, every editor had to write a book. Every writer, I think everybody who works in publishing, on the publishing side or on the writing side, would be well served to have worked in a bookstore. To have spent like a year as a bookseller interacting with customers at the ground level. That would be incredibly instructive, I would have to believe. And to have been, even if you're not going to be like a marketing person or a publicity person, if you're working inside of a publishing house, you have proximity to those people and to those processes. And so to spend several years doing that has to be useful to you now, even in ways that you might not fully understand. It could be something subconscious, that's working on you when you're making creative choices in your work, right? I mean, am I barking up the right tree?
No, yeah. I think you're right on the money, and I think that the goal, whenever I look at a page, whether it's a blank page of mine or a student that I'm working with, it's always with the goal of what story is the writer, whether it's me or somebody else. What story are they trying to tell, and what is the best and most effective way that person can tell that story? And and sometimes it's like, like throwing out pages, or sometimes it's like just knocking out the opening, and like giving yourself that latitude and that freedom to say that like all possible outcomes, all possible ideas are on the table in order to get to where the story wants us to go. And I think that for me, always understanding that like even as a writer, right, even as somebody who spends way longer on books than I would, 6.5 years, I wish I could write faster, I wish I could publish faster. But to me, it's always about, what does the story want? What does the story want? What story wants to be told? Where essentially is the crux of your main character's goal or desire, right? Like I guess I'm trying to think of like something pithy to like sum this up, and like everything is escaping me at the moment. But the thing that I come back to time and again is when you're writing a book, you're writing a short story, or whatever, it's like there's somebody on the other side, there's a reader. What if you have that one sentence, if you have that one line, what do you want their takeaway to be? And if you can focus on that, if you can focus on the takeaway, what's the takeaway here, right? Because I feel that happens all the time, where like a writer will say, oh, I want this, this, and this, and it's nowhere on the page. And I'm like, well, just put it on the page. And that was advice I had to take for myself as well. It's like, if you could just remember, focus on the takeaway and make sure it finds its way to the page. You might be able to have, hopefully, a more joyful experience creating, writing, and revising.
And the reader will be happier, most likely, right?
Yes, yes. The reader will feel satisfied. I spent $28 for this. I got my money's worth.
There you go. Well, I always ask people before we part company if they're working on anything new. Like, I know we're just putting this book out into the world, so it's fine if you don't have anything going, but usually writers have irons in the fire. Is there another book in the works?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are a couple of books that neither of which I want to spend 6.5 years working on. So hopefully it'll happen a little more quickly. One of them I think will require me to go to Spain. So next year, I think sometime maybe in the spring, I'll be in Spain for a couple of months doing some research. And the other book might be a little more closer to home. But yeah,
This is fiction? It's fiction?
Yeah, they're both fiction. I really do enjoy writing nonfiction as well. But I felt like, since I literally put all of those great nonfiction stories that I told you in one book, as opposed to spreading them all out, maybe quite foolish in retrospect.
No.
I don't have a volume 2 on tap yet. So yeah, I think I'm going to stick with novels for the foreseeable future.
All right. Well, Brando, it's been a pleasure to meet you. Congratulations on My Name is Iris, and best of luck in Spain and with whatever comes next.
Thank you so much, Brad. It was a pleasure to talk with you today.